It was November 1980. Ronald Reagan had just defeated Jimmy Carter in the U.S. presidential election, and Bill Gates, barely 25 years old, had already been running Microsoft for more than 5 years with his childhood friend Paul Allen when he showed up at Husky Stadium at the University of Washington in Seattle, not entirely prepared for the fall weather.
All I can remember was it was a pretty brisk day, and he showed up in like a T-shirt or something. So I had a sport coat on, and I think I gave him my sport coat just to keep him warm.
That's David Marquardt speaking in a recent interview with GeekWire. A former mechanical engineer with a deep interest in the nascent personal computer market, Marquardt was early in his career as a Silicon Valley investor at the time.
I had never met Bill, but I had seen him present at the Homebrew Computer Club back when I was an engineer. And he makes a strong impression when you hear him for the first time.
Marquardt had already met with Steve Ballmer, who had joined Microsoft earlier that year. And as a follow-up, the future Microsoft CEO had arranged for Marquardt to meet up with the Microsoft co-founder in the Gates family's box at the Husky football game.
So we really didn't watch much of the game. He spent a lot of time on the back of the program outlining his compiler architecture and what he was doing with the company. It was a very technical first meeting. Not a lot of small talk.
Microsoft had not taken any outside investment to that point, and it really didn't need to. It had annual profits of $2 million to $3 million on about $5 million in revenue. But the following year, after overcoming some skepticism from his partners, Marquardt led his firm's investment in the fledgling software company. He remembers the terms exactly.
Yeah, we invested $1 million for 5% of the company. So it was a $20 million valuation, which everyone told me that's a ridiculous. I mean, paying, 4 times revenues for a software company. Anyway, it worked out.
Yes, it definitely worked out. 5 years and a few months after that football game, on March 13th, 1986, Microsoft went public on the New York Stock Exchange, closing its first day of trading at a market value of more than $500 million. The company is worth more than $3.1 trillion today. Welcome to a special edition of the GeekWire podcast. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. This is the first in a 4-episode series that we'll be publishing in the months ahead. It's part of our year-long Microsoft at 50 project, recognizing the company's 50th anniversary in April 2025. On this episode, we'll take a fresh look at Microsoft's startup story with tech historian and author Margaret O'Mara of the University of Washington, plus more highlights from my conversation with David Marquardt, Microsoft's first investor. We'll be right back after this. Microsoft at 50 is an independent GeekWire editorial project made possible with support from Accenture.
Hello, John Gingrich here, Senior Managing Director and Global Lead of our Microsoft account at Accenture. Accenture proudly recognizes Microsoft's 50th anniversary, and we're honored to mark our 35-year relationship as a trusted partner and change driver, delivering comprehensive services spanning 120 countries in support of Microsoft's enterprise. Together, we're positioned to deliver transformation for the next 50 years. We're ready. Let there be change.
For more installments in the Microsoft at 50 series and links to more information about Accenture's work with Microsoft, see geekwire.com/Microsoft50. That's geekwire.com/Microsoft50. For this installment in our Microsoft at 50 series, I spent the past month revisiting Microsoft's early years, from its founding in 1975 to its IPO in 1986, looking for enduring takeaways and insights from its startup story. A conversation with tech historian Margaret O'Mara, author of The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America, helped to transport me back to that era. How does the story of Microsoft's founding compare and contrast with other well-known tech company founders? Page, Brin, Jobs, Wozniak, Hewlett, Packard. Can you give me a sense for where they fit in?
Well, it's actually a very familiar story. It's 2 very young guys. Gates and Allen, who were young and then knew each other when they were even younger, who come together, sort of similar to the two Steves, Wozniak and Jobs, and the founding of Apple. And also, very small scale beginnings, but very quickly getting critical infusions of capital and business partnerships with bigger players, right? So obviously, Microsoft is a Seattle company founded by two Seattleites, briefly is born in Albuquerque, but moves up here when it's only a few years old. But it also was a Silicon Valley company in that its critical early venture capital infusions came from Valley VCs. In order to invest in early Microsoft, a VC had to come and go to a Husky game with Bill and his parents as part of the rite of passage. So you had to, they show you were deeply interested in Seattle. And of course, the customers and the community and the workforce, it was just really tightly connected. And moving up here was a choice not only to come home, but also to, in a way, give something of a competitive advantage in the job market for programmers, where if they had been down in California, they would have been competing with a lot of other startup companies. And up here, there were some startup companies, but not quite as many. And there was obviously the engineering workforce around the University of Washington.
When you look at what they built, just in a basic sense, what were the key ingredients to Microsoft's success back then?
The key ingredients, software was not an industry. Desktop computing didn't even exist at the start of the 70s. And so what they were able to do was to latch on to this nascent industry, even when it isn't even an industry. It's kind of the desktop computer is kind of moving from this hobbyist toy to something that you actually put on a shelf and sell. And the Altair, which they moved to Albuquerque to build the operating system and the software for, was the first kit you could buy, something that was one step beyond you're going to Radio Shack and just getting the parts and you're soldering it yourself. And so they were getting in right on the ground floor. They also were, both of them, and Allen gets credit for this too, although Gates was the signatory to the infamous Gates letter that he sent to the hobbyists of the homebrew club in Silicon Valley saying, don't steal our software. But they also were charging for something that in the hobbyist community was being given away for free. And that was novel. That was, they were again on the ground floor, one of the very, very first enterprises doing that. And on the one hand, it's, getting on the launch pad as the rocket ship's about to go off, but also being pretty aggressive and elbowing competitors aside, and especially, quite aggressive, and making sure that you're first to it, and then, famously striking a deal with IBM that not only gets it the IBM PC business, but also is a platform that can be cloned, and it isn't a closed ecosystem. So it just creates this market that turns out to be globally dominant.
David Marquardt, Microsoft's first outside investor, saw this skepticism about software firsthand.
So at that point in time, I was a big believer in personal computers. I thought it was going to be a huge wave. And I was maybe a little bit ahead of my time because the guys that I worked for, I was the junior partner there, sort of said, well, every once in a while, these entrepreneurs will come in with a software business plan, and we would never invest in software because marginal price will eventually equal marginal cost equals zero. There's no business there.
Because the cost of producing another copy of a software program was effectively zero, their theory went, competition would push prices towards zero as well, leaving little room for profits.
And I didn't believe that. I thought that I thought the value was going to be in software, because that was going to be the bridge that was going to bring the masses, well, at least businesses at first, and then eventually the masses into the personal computer. So I got pretty excited about Microsoft, but it was a bit of an uphill battle to convince my partners to invest.
Some of you out there experienced this whole era firsthand, like I did as a kid. It was hard not to reminisce a little bit during my conversation with historian Margaret O'Mara. And so they were able to take advantage of that proliferation of hardware due to the clones. It's funny. I was born in 1973. I'm 51. And I've been having all these memories of, like, my first IBM clone was the leading edge personal computer, the one with the little multicolored triangle. And we had the Apple IIe. This has been a little bit of a kind of retro thing for me too. But those computers are the ones that cemented that business decision by Microsoft to focus. Is that one of the principles that can be taken
Yeah.
away, like that decision to focus and go a little against the grain?
Yeah, but it can cut both ways, right? Like you can focus on something and it turns out that that's not the way the world is
Right.
turning. But I think that, look, I mean, software as a service and software as a product existed before Microsoft, obviously, but it had typically, in the case of the mainframes, been bundled in as a kind of add-on. You buy an IBM mainframe and you get the software. You had companies like actually famously Ross Perot's EDS, which was doing software services for these mainframe operations. That was where they got their start. And Perot himself, actually, Bill and Perot had a meeting to see if Perot was going to invest. I wish I could have gotten a time
Oh my
capsule
gosh.
and been in that room. That would have been amazing.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I think there was like $1 million on the table at one point. And then Perot also pops up, 6 years later, investing in Next after Steve Jobs gets fired. But he just he's like the Forrest Gump of this whole story. He just keeps on showing up. Yeah, he's great. Business success is always a combination of bottom up and top down, right? It's the winds of opportunity blow a certain way and you seize opportunity when you see it, but also it's being ready and in the right place, right time when the opportunity comes. It's always a two-way street. Sometimes that can be frustrating if you're a founder and you want to have control, you want to be able to control the environment. It also can be frustrating, when you're, it kind of pushes against the grain of the free enterprise story that we in tech like to celebrate, oh, we did it all our own. And no, actually, it's all part of this bigger picture. And that's also, I think, helps us really understand what are the ingredients for startup success. You just need an environment that's going to be really conducive for, you to be able to get on that rocket ship and fly up. And there are other things, preconditions, educational, institutional, the place you're at, how easy or difficult it is to actually run a business in that place. It makes a big difference.
I asked David Marquardt to go a little deeper into his reasons for investing in Microsoft. If you were to look at Microsoft then through the lens of the things that venture capitalists think about now, long-term customer value, product market fit, how would you explain the opportunity that Microsoft represented as an investment at the time through the lens of the metrics that venture capitalists use today?
Okay, well, I wasn't anywhere near that sophisticated back then. Again, I was a big believer in software. I was a big believer in the PC. And so I went and I looked at all the other leading software companies at the time. I visited Personal Software, VisiCalc. I visited MicroPro, I think, with their WordStar. I visited DRI. They had that operating system, CPM. And when I went and met with Bill, the football game was, that was our first meeting. But then the next meeting that we had, he knew more about those other competitors than they did, he was compelling. I mean, he was totally steeped in it. He was working pretty much 24/7. He was young. He was smart. He didn't have too many other distractions at the time. He knew almost every line of code. He knew all the people, where they came from, what their grades were. I mean, it was just like, and so if you were looking at this universe at the time, he was compelling. And so the investment was really in Bill and Steve at the time more than product market fit or any of that other stuff.
But are there lessons that startup founders today can take from what Bill Gates and Paul Allen and later Steve Ballmer did in the early days and years of Microsoft? Here's Margaret O'Mara on that question.
It's interesting. On the one hand, yes, and also their experience and the experience of other, iconic startups turned tech giants like Apple have kind of left such a big imprint on how startups understand the startup game, right? So it's sort of a little bit of a chicken and egg. What was early Microsoft? I mean, the first mention of Microsoft in the Seattle Times, for example, the first editorial mention was in a article about the tech scene in Seattle that mentioned Microsoft with a kind of a chain of startups, none of which sound familiar to me now. Part of the lesson is that everyone's a startup originally. It isn't clearly obvious at the beginning, like, oh, this is going to be successful. But I think the Microsoft story is interesting. I mean, yes, it's a story of like relentlessness and 14-hour days, 7 days a week, and a story of screaming matches in the office between Gates and Allen. A very hard charging atmosphere and a very intense atmosphere. But it also is one of really strategic business alliances and partnerships really early, obviously most notably with IBM, but also thinking about the David Marquardts of the world and thinking about the way in which, I think there was certainly an advantage that Gates and Allen, and particularly Gates, had in contrast to, say, Steve and Steve. They came from, they had families that were, professional families who were very connected into the Seattle business community and the more regional and national business community. Not that that was the reason for their success, but they're different than some of the other startup founders who are coming from, kind of really coming with few connections and just a brash attitude and a willingness to do what it takes. But I think that for all of the shouting matches and kind of the stories of Bill's personality, he was also trying to assert himself as a business leader at age 19, 20, 21, and when he looked like he was 12, and really trying to get into rooms that people like him, his age and stage, wouldn't ordinarily have been given admission. I think there's definitely a lesson of kind of having a great belief in what you're doing and doing what it takes to get it done.
It's an interesting point that you raise about their upbringing, because in certain respects, they came from places of privilege. I mean, there's a reason that they were able to sneak into that room late at night and access those computers. And, kids from, I don't know, whatever, wouldn't have had those opportunities, not only because of geography, but also because their parents wouldn't have been a lawyer or the librarian at the UW.
And they were at Lakeside, where the parents and the teachers kind of got together and raised money to create a computer room. I mean, that was not par for the course in high schools in the late 60s and the early 70s. So they had these opportunities that were unusual. And again, and I don't think that detracts from what they accomplished, but because there are plenty of people who had plenty of privilege and didn't do it, didn't build what they built, but that does set them apart. And I think what it underscores, and I think this is a useful lesson for founders then and now, is success does come with, support of more mainline institutions. And, the new economy grows on old economy foundations. And you see this with, venture capital, even the VC industry itself. Where did it originally get its money to invest in companies like Microsoft and Apple, or one generation before them? Well, it came from, family offices and the wealth of earlier generations of American capitalism, kind of the old economy money. And so too, like University of Washington Computer Lab, funded by government money in the main, and a state university, plays a really critical role in the education and development of these two entrepreneurs and their business.
So one of the challenges that I've had in reporting this series is, as a general rule, we try and make sure our coverage reflects as much diversity as possible, gender and otherwise. And when I'm going back to talk with people from Microsoft's early years, if they were in the room, they were generally white men. And you have written about how that perpetuated itself, in part because when Microsoft went public and all those people were able to cash in on their stock options, then that became the wealth in the region. And can you speak to that, how Microsoft's approach to hiring and the tech industry's biases in those days rolled through the decades?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, Microsoft is this landmark software company that really, creates an entire industry effectively. But software programming itself was originally a female-dominated profession. And even in the early years of Microsoft's existence, most of the programmers, the people who kind of fit that not at Microsoft, but kind of people in the software programming field, were predominantly female, which is kind of a lost history that's often forgotten. It was partially because it was not seen as a super valuable, highly lucrative profession. It was seen as something that was, for a very long time, something was more rote and not creative. And the real magic came in the hardware design, and the software just sat on top of that. And there also wasn't money to be made. It wasn't a standalone industry. It didn't have the real upside. And I think Microsoft's story is really instructive. First, there are things that are particular to Microsoft. that are reflective of the time. Yeah, the personal computer industry, the early desktop computing industry is overwhelmingly male too. There are women, there are female founders, there are female executives. Companies like Apple actually had a considerable number of female executives. And in fact, the first employees of Microsoft included several women. I mean, when it was tiny, like in Albuquerque, it was, it had female employees. But very quickly, as it starts growing, and it grows fast in those early years here in Seattle, there's a certain work culture that is very hard charging, that is a tone that is set by Bill and Steve, and particularly by Bill. One early employee kind of later reflected that, we hired a bunch of little Bills. There was recruiting of guys fresh out of college. Microsoft did for a long time, did really intensive recruiting of younger people who were coming straight out of programs and kind of hadn't worked other places. That was actually a deliberate choice. You kind of created a culture and people grew up in that culture, and it was incredibly hardworking. There was not a big emphasis on work-life balance. Historically, that's one of the things that has driven a lot of women out of technical roles in the tech industry over time, where you have this kind of relentless and very kind of male-coded and male-dominated culture that is all about work and doesn't give a lot of flexibility for caregiving or other things outside of work. Saying that, I will say that Paul Allen did, even in those early years, have a better sense of like work-life balance. He worked a lot, but he also had liked to have fun on the side. It was a little more social and slightly more easygoing. His rec was slightly more laid back than Bill's. But but it's a very, very intense environment. And I think that the very, very early Microsoft, like a lot of startup companies, it paid people on the low end of the scale, but gave them stock options, which initially were like, well, that's nice to have, but what's it done for me lately? That changes dramatically in 1986 when Microsoft goes public. And you have kind of instant millionaires. And Microsoft's not the only company that had that experience. But all of a sudden, programming software, designing software, the work that Microsoft did was now a highly, highly valuable profession and something that was valued and celebrated. And at the same time, Microsoft was an overwhelmingly male environment. It was, one Silicon Valley observer later called it the frat house from another planet. And even though people in the Valley were, it was a lot of professional jealousy that colored the Valley's perceptions of Microsoft in those days, because they basically kind of were so dominant in the software market. But it was. And this is similar to the environment of the semiconductor industry of the 60s and 70s, where a lot of the venture capitalists came from, who were the mentors of the PC generation folks. It was very hard charging. It was pretty relentlessly workaholic, and you had to be super, super tough and willing to, yell it out to get your point across. It was something that was a very particular environment that could be very discouraging to people that didn't feel like they fit into it.
Reading back, especially Hard Drive, the book by James Wallace and Jim Erickson, it's painful. I mean, some of the anecdotes in there, specific instances of alleged gender bias, it's painful to read.
Yeah. It's painful and it's real. It's an industry-wide problem. It's not in the past. It's still with us. And the thing that's really challenging is some of the things that make the industry and companies like Microsoft so successful, which is this kind of intense drive to, build product, ship product, this team-based approach that's extraordinarily intense. That is also something that contributes to, being a difficult place to work for people of any gender or any background, but also can contribute to a continued homogeneity where some people feel like they fit and some people feel like they don't. And personal relationships drive a lot of the hiring choices and the personal and the professional bleed over. In any place where you're working 7 days a week, your life is your job and vice versa. And so then again, kind of having people who are like you or people that you would, kind of get along with socially, that also kind of colors who you're deciding to hire, who you're recruiting. Hiring people who know someone that that's hiring by referral continues to be a very important part of the way the tech industry, whether it be startups or large companies, the way that you recruit and grow.
Apart from the startup realm, one of the big picture questions I've been trying to ask folks that I talk to is, what's the significance of this company in modern corporate history or modern tech history when you think about Microsoft?
Wow, there's so much that's significant about this company. When we think about this iconic startups of, that Microsoft didn't start in a garage per se, but Lakeside Computer Lab, I guess we'd call it that. That's a garage. But these companies started by very young technical men that are, grow into these, enormous companies. And Microsoft was big tech before the rest of big tech. IBM was the original big tech, but Microsoft really very quickly succeeds IBM. And the swiftness, when we think about, here we are 50 years of Microsoft. Wow, that's a long time. But when we think about the rapidity of the rise of Microsoft, when you are kind of going from 1975 to 1979, by the time they're coming here from Albuquerque, they've already established themselves in this niche market. To be clear, they're still quite small, but they are growing really, really rapidly, and their revenue is growing rapidly. They go public by 1986. By the end of the 1990s, more than 90% of the PCs in the world, of the computers in the world, are running Microsoft software. Like, it is unbelievable, the market dominance, the size, the wealth, and certainly for this region, the way that, Greater Seattle has always been kind of a company town sort of place, right? First it was timber, then it was Boeing, and then it's Microsoft and tech, but really Microsoft. It was Microsoft's town for a very long time. Even after Amazon was established and was growing, it's only in the last, I'd say, decade and change that it's been Microsoft and Amazon's town, that Amazon's kind of taken such a central role in our political economy and our regional conversation. But Microsoft has done so much to kind of define what this place is for 50 years, but its ascent was really rapid, which is extraordinary. And I think also the antitrust battles of the late 1990s are also something that make Microsoft stand out after decades in which sort of federal antitrust was sort of stepping back from putting the pedal on the gas. The whole saga of how, where, why Microsoft was sued by the Department of Justice and what happened is a real, first it's kind of a story in and of itself, but now in this era of growing tech antitrust enforcement, it's kind of the canary in the coal mine of which, ironically, Microsoft is one of the few companies that is not currently being sued or under investigation by the FTC, which is a rich irony.
It seems like maybe they learned the lesson.
I think they did. They did. Yeah, no, I think they will say, we learned the hard way that this is, you need to approach, relationships with the government just differently.
Yeah. Anything else you would just say on the whole topic of Microsoft as a startup, things to think about, takeaways from their early years?
Well, I think that the kind of high octane, super combative culture of Microsoft, I think generally is not as common in startups these days. I like to think it might have given the impression at one point that this was part of growing a company. I can say, as someone who's analyzed a lot of these companies over time, having yelling matches in the hallway and the elevator are not necessary to build and ship great product or be a, iconic tech company. So please, founders, don't take that as a lesson. It has to do with personality. But I think that the kind of relentlessness and the vision of Bill in particular, that's just so evident at such a young age, is something that is part of the formula. It's not the only thing. Again, I think too many observers have kind of taken the lesson of these kind of extraordinary outsized personalities of Jobs and Gates, for example, particularly in their younger years. I'm talking about them when they're, quite much younger, as like, oh, this is how you do it. And no, they were, there's a bigger vision behind that. And it also is always a team effort. So that's the other thing. Microsoft is, yes, it is Paul and it's Bill and it's Steve, but it's also so many other people who were there at the ground floor and were there in the early years and who built it, technical people and non-technical people. And an ecosystem, a Seattle ecosystem, a broader tech industry ecosystem that enabled them to do what they did. And that's a super important lesson for any founder, any startup leader, to remember that it's about much more than just you. Having your cast of thousands, both in and outside the company, is really important.
Margaret O'Mara is a historian at the University of Washington and author of The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. See the show notes and the related article on GeekWire for links to her book and more of her work in American history. David Marquardt observed that Microsoft has made a habit of capitalizing on what he described as discontinuities in technology, such as the shift from mainframes to PCs and from servers to the cloud. Before ending our conversation, I asked him to put Microsoft's current work in AI in the context of that observation.
They were there early on. They made a bold investment in OpenAI, and it looks like they're in a very good position, I think. The AI business has become a big CapEx business, and they have amongst the lowest cost of capital of anybody in that game. So I feel that they're in a great position. I don't think it's going to be a winner-take-all business. I mean, there's going to be it should be big enough that there'll be 3 or 4 major players, but I think Microsoft will clearly be one of them and maybe the leader.
Big picture, I'm trying to ask everybody this question, and I realize it's a big one to wrestle with, but what is the significance of this company in modern history, if you were to think about it and put it in the context of the industrialized society and the technological society?
If you look at it from an economic point of view, the only way that you can increase wealth and prosperity and reduction of poverty, et cetera, is through increases in productivity. And Microsoft, through all these different generations, have figured out how to make people way more productive. It's not just white collar workers, it's everybody. I mean, all the things that lead to that increase in productivity for everyone, I think that's the revolution that Microsoft drove from very early days.
David Marquardt was Microsoft's first outside investor as a partner in Technology Venture Investors, or TVI, back in 1981. He went on to co-found August Capital in 1995 and served on the Microsoft board of directors for 33 years, from 1981 until 2014. Thank you for listening. See GeekWire.com for our deep dive on Microsoft's startup years, our earlier installment about Microsoft's history and future in AI, and stay tuned in the months ahead for more stories and episodes in our Microsoft at 50 series. We also have a special Microsoft at 50 event coming up on March 20th, 2025 in Seattle. You can see the show notes and the related article on GeekWire.com for links related to all of this. Thanks to Accenture for making this project possible. Curt Milton edited this episode. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We'll be back this weekend with our regular weekly episode of the GeekWire podcast.